Welcome to the Focus on Why podcast. I'm Amy Rowlandson and I ask my guests one simple question. Why? Focusing on the importance of why, I share with you the relatable, uplifting and inspiring conversations I have with people from all walks of life. This podcast will encourage you to focus on your why to enable and empower you to achieve the success you desire. Have a purpose, have a plan, focus on why. Before we start, I would like to draw your attention to my weekly email newsletter, Friday Focus. Each Friday, I focus on one topic with one action arising. The link to sign up is in the show notes, or head over to amyrowlandson.com and sign up right now. Today on Focus on Why, I am joined by Guy Clapperton. Welcome, Guy. How are you?
Very well, thanks indeed. And you?
I'm very well, thank you. So what brings you here today? What is it that you're doing at the moment, Guy?
Well, I have two strands to my business. First of all, there is the media training that's based on 30 years plus as a journalist. I've realized over the years that there are too many people out there who just get led around and interviewed by the nose by journalists. And when I say journalists, that's very much a generational thing. I could also mean podcasters and various other media types. They get led around and the journalist or other outlet gets the interview they wanted and to the structure that they wanted, which is great for us on our side as broadcasters, as journalists, but it means that we can actually miss out on the expertise being offered because we don't necessarily know the question that's going to get that particular answer, which would be really helpful to our listeners, to our readers, or anything like that. And you never really get away from being a journalist when you've been doing it 30 years. So I also have a podcast called the Near Futurist. That was based on, well, a couple of things. First of all, I missed Tomorrow's World dreadfully, always watched it and always wanted to be on it. So the internet has given me the facility to have my own little chat show there. Also always wanted a chat show, so now I've got one. So me and the small chihuahua in Peckham who listen to it, I thoroughly enjoy every episode, I'm sure. It also means, of course, that if someone is if someone is wanting to use me as a media trainer and thinks, oh, is this one of these media trainers, him and his team who used to be a journalist 20, 30 years ago or something, they can listen to something that was in the last few weeks and think, can I actually learn from this person? Does he actually still do interviews?
And it's interesting you sort of discern a difference there between podcasters, journalists and broadcasters. And yet, you know, what would you say the difference is and how would that you describe them?
I think the differences are fading over the years. What I meant to say was that, as somebody who's in my 50s, I tend to use the word journalist as a reflex. I do regard you as a journalist. On the other hand, although there's no such thing as a license for a journalist, there's no such thing as a barrier to entry for a journalist. Very frequently, there are qualifications. You can get qualifications. I'm sure those will arrive if they're not already for podcasters and for bloggers and for people like that. But if somebody has been a journalist for any length of time, I would expect them to have had some elementary training in the laws of libel. They would have some idea of whether, for example, I get from a number of podcasters I see, they're always very keen on having disclosure forms that say that they may broadcast what's been said. In the world of journalism, if you speak to a journalist, then common sense dictates that you're not speaking to them unless you're expecting your words to be reproduced. I would also have an idea of, I think I just mentioned libel laws and when to check, when not to. I know a lot of, sorry, I'm yapping on at some length here. I know an awful lot of people who are in perhaps new to the podcast world or to the blogging world can get very intimidated when they're told, you need to show me what you're going to put out there before you're allowed to release it. It's tosh. It doesn't stand up in law. If someone's agreed to talk to you and they haven't specified that it's off the record or something, then you have every right to broadcast whatever you wish from them because they've made that implied contract willingly. So those are the things I might expect a more formally trained journalist or even an informally trained journalist on the job to understand. Someone who is just working in isolation from a spare room, which is an increasingly important part of the media landscape. I'm not denigrating that. May not have that depth of experience or those resources to fall back on. It's all very well for me saying that a journalist might have some training, but where's a blogger or where's a podcaster supposed to get that training?
And it's interesting, Guy, because we have evolved into a world where you can be a global broadcaster from your bedroom. And anybody has access to do that.
Absolutely right. If you actually think the whole world could be receiving this, then that's quite a responsibility. And then you're thinking, well, what if I break, I don't know, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, what if I break a libel law that exists in Indonesia or somewhere? I'm just picking a country about which I know very little there. So I think, those are advantages I think journalists who are working for established publications will have because they've got that backup behind them. The new world, it still is a little bit sort of Wild West. But if you libel someone, you will still find that they can take you to court.
So you mentioned right at the beginning there that people are missing out on, or could be potentially missing out on, the expertise by not getting that particular answer for questions and asking the right questions. What's the skill that's involved?
Well, first, I think listening is very important on the journalist's part, and also doing the research. So often, the other thing about working and doing things from your bedroom is there is never enough time to research somebody or your interviewee as you wish you could. There's also the fact that journalists and other media participants tend to be experts in what they do. You do a really good podcast. You're great at asking questions. You're great at making people feel they're in a comfortable place where they could talk. That's brilliant. If you were doing something on, say, technology security, as I've been known to do, you wouldn't necessarily be the technical expert in tech security. So you might not know that you shouldn't be asking about I don't know, perimeter security anymore. You should be asking about overall security, or you should be asking about phishing with a PH. These are all sort of common words, but you might not be aware of what the next thing is, whereas the person you're speaking to probably is the expert on that. So when I'm media training people on the other side, I tend to try and get them to have the confidence to take over and to put their own agenda forward, because they will have those insights. They'll be closer to the market than the person asking the question ever can be. I try not to get them to be overtly commercial, because then that just ends up as a cutting room floor job. But I try to make sure they have the confidence and and some techniques, some strategies to make sure that they get their points out there, because that's really what the listener, what the reader wants to see. They want the interviewee's expertise, not the journalist's rough guess, which could be a very good guess, but a rough guess nonetheless, as to what exactly the readers are going to find essential.
And this audience that you're working towards, we all have different audiences, we all have a different readership, and it's piquing their interest, it's keeping their interest, it's educating them, it's a whole variety of things. What are you trying to achieve with your work, Guy?
I get right back to the old BBC in the 1920s, 100 years ago, indeed, this year, the Lord Reed's thing about to educate, inform, and entertain. I think there are some journals these days, certainly some of the academic journals, that they form very different purpose. But I think there are sometimes I read quite a lot of, say, technology publications, and they get quite dry, and they forget that, particularly in the age of the internet, which we're well into now, the choice of what you can read instead or what you can go and see instead is enormous. So, yes, they've got to inform, and you've got to, informing people is all about the audience and where that audience is at that particular point. So if you're talking to a consumer publication, you get rid of as much jargon as you possibly can. If you're talking to a technology publication, or if you're not in technology, if you're talking to a marketing publication, then you can use words like KPIs, things like that, key performance indicators, because the business audience will understand what you're talking about. If you start talking about KPIs and you're in one of the mainstream press, then you might find that the journalists won't query it because they'll understand it. But if they accidentally put it in to the copy rather than explain it, then you've left the reader thinking, "Oh, what's that mean then?" And then they're distracted because they'll go and they'll click away. They'll look up KPIs in Google and I think that's interesting. Oh, look, there's an interesting link down there. And before you know where you are, you've lost them completely.
With the age of the internet and the evolution of technology and your keen interest in tomorrow's world, and tell us more about what the Near Futurist does and how it evolves, or how it is evolving to move with the times.
Of course, I have to give credit to my business mentor a few years ago, or speaking mentor, Alan Stevens. We were trying to work out what I should do to make to get my voice out there a little bit more. this started actually, my wife had told me that one of the problems with my business was that she says, and I know she's biased, but she says I've got a good voice. She says I have got a good voice, which just cracked there, which has ruined that completely, but never mind. So my wife said I've got a good voice, and that just wasn't on my website. And so I was going through this with Alan. We were working on developing my speaking, MCing career, that sort of thing. And he said, what you could do it is a podcast. And you've got this 30 years as a technology journalist behind you. And we said, yeah, that's a good idea. And we just chatted about what I'd seen from other people. And without any disrespect to any of the people who do this, I'd seen an awful lot of presenters, speakers, podcasters at conferences on the wires, this sort of thing, calling themselves futurists and talking about stuff that's going to happen in the next, say, 30, 40 years. Now, of course, we're an audio podcast, so your listeners can't see how impossibly young I look, but I do have a little grey hair, which is starting to show, and you're now giggling uncontrollably because it's obviously completely wild. Basically, by the time 30, 40 years have gone past, this is of academic interest to me only. I wish everybody send my regards to the future, but I'm hoping not to be working by that stage. Physically working would be good, but I take nothing for granted. So I thought, we were just chatting, and I said, what I want to talk about is the near future. And I can't remember which of us it was said, oh, yes, you need to be a near futurist. And then we just sort of looked at each other and thought, that's a very nice brand, isn't it? So the near futurist came from that. I then drew on, I very quickly, I came to the conclusion that it had to be me interviewing experts, because if I believe, and my whole motivation for the media training is that I'm not the expert, I need to get other people confident in producing their expertise. I had to get other people on, so I decided immediately it was an interview show. And drew on my contacts in the PR industry, said, look, I'm starting this podcast. Does anybody want to pony up somebody with no guarantee that anybody's going to listen? And that was 3.5 years ago. And it's had a little rest just recently, but it's going to be coming back with, and it has a sponsor these days, that's Diffusion Public Relations, who do not interfere editorial a great deal. They're very helpful in suggesting guests and suggesting topics. But then when it comes to writing the questions, things like that, they have no... that they don't want any say. I think they just trust me to go and get on with it. So there's no editorial bias, which is a lovely position to be in. And it's getting, it's growing steadily, I would say.
So let's talk near future. Near future for you means what in terms of a timeline?
Near future, I would say about 5 years. It's not so much the time, in fact. One person, ace wind-up merchant, once said to me, yes, I talked to, say, Rohit Talwar or Graham Codrington about what's happening in possibly the next century in 2050. And if I want to know what's happening next Tuesday, I'll ask Guy, which is, the caricature thing. But to me, it's got to be actionable. Now, there are things that you have to forecast longer term, which have to be actionable if we want to get to our climate change targets, our carbon targets for 2050. It's no use thinking, well, that's all right, we'll do something about that in 2049. We've got to start now. And as we're recording, we just had this announcement from America about its investment in carbon technologies, which is great. But I would rather everybody went away from my podcast thinking I could do that at work, or I could do that in my private life, or this is going to be important to me. I'm just trying to get one off the ground at the moment about eating insects outside of I'm a celebrity, get me out of here. But that appears to be there are a number of businesses starting up in that way. I've done one quite recently on lab grown or other factory developed meat, which my brother's a vegetarian. I was asking him about this, and he was saying, if there's no animals involved, you could have a vegetarian steak, which is actually a steak, which is an interesting possibility. So there's all those things coming in. I've also done stuff on the workplace. I'm trying to keep it a balance between stuff that's going to be interesting to the to people at work, but also people in their private lives. The consumer market's very important to me.
And what's piqued your interest of all the interviews you've had so far, Guy, most?
Well, I think there was one on vertical farming, which is where you basically do high-rise farming instead of putting it all in fields, which I found that quite interesting. Quite interesting. Sounds a bit faint praise, but for those of international listeners, I am British. That's me going berserk. By the way, this is just what we do. I also really found that there was one that actually my mother-in-law really enjoyed, funnily enough, was one on hearing aids. And it started off with a question, why can you have fashionable glasses? As you can see, I don't. Why can you have fashionable glasses? Why are they an accessory that improves your appearance? Hearing aids, they just help another sense, and they're almost always perceived as a negative. And it's a sign that you're getting old, it's a sign you can't hear, etc. And the best thing people think they can do is to cover them up. Whereas if you have headphones or headsets, I see we're both wearing these nice white, probably best not mention the brand name, all gets a bit fruity there. But we've got these earpieces in, and and yet immediately they are of medical use. That it's suddenly it becomes very dull, very boring. So we did a very nice piece on how it was the Bluetooth special interest group is or was working on ways of combining those things so that you could have prescription earbuds. So they would help you with the ordinary hearing. They would pick up from the television, amplify it for you, but then also, just work in day-to-day conversation as well as playing music to you, and become a bit of a fashion accessory. So that I found quite interesting, because I could see myself, as I get older, I could see myself thinking, oh yeah, I don't much fancy wearing a hearing aid, but why don't I? I've been wearing glasses since I was 10 and not batted an eyelid.
Yeah, really interesting. It is fascinating how you seem to have one foot in the future and one foot firmly in the past in terms of recognizing the values that you sort of used from the BBC, the 1920s, of educate, inform, and entertain. So where is Guy in the present? What is it that your focus on why element, where does that come in?
Right. At the moment, I'm trying to build up my media training business because I have a little team assembled. I haven't used many of them yet because there's been this pandemic around the world. So just when I was starting to get that going, of course, face-to-face training stopped. But I do have a camera operator. I have an actor, Sophie Aldred, who I've worked with, and there's a couple of pitches out there at the moment to use third parties to train on my behalf. I've been working with an excellent business mentor, a guy called Niels Brabant, who has also built himself a training business over the years. He was actually a client, and he suggested that I should consider building this up, because he felt the training he'd had was very good, and I should be building this up. And that suggestion came in my early 50s, and I thought, yeah, why not build something up so that it's a proper brand, and there's something left when I decide to retire in my mid to late 60s. And I'm really rather enjoying that, working with other people. It's very stimulating, all based on the idea of bringing people out of themselves, of giving themselves confidence, of making sure that if a cynical journalist comes in, they're not all, by the way. It's a bit like driving instructors. I try to prepare people for the worst drivers, but actually, from your own driving, I'm sure when you get out there, 99.9% of them are fine, but you've got to have those skills to deal with the maniac who's speeding or on the wrong side of the road or drunk or whatever. So I'm not suggesting journalists are drunk with some drive, but anyway, not all journalists. I'm going to stop speaking about that now. But I'm thoroughly enjoying the process of building that up. I've got more admin support from my virtual assistant. Again, that was a suggestion from Alan that I should get admin support. It's one of these strange things I find speakers and very small businesses, they're very happy to use accountants. But when it comes to some sort of more admin support, it's sort of, oh no, I'm freelance, I've got to do that by myself, as if it's some sort of religion. Once I'd let someone else take over my calendar and invoicing and things like that, it was, oh, I don't have to do that anymore. Oh, that's good. And I'm really, the quality of life improvements have been very considerable, and it's not as expensive as you'd imagine. So it's basically growing that a bit. And I would like, as the thing grows and as it becomes more feasible, I'd also like to bring in a couple of guest presenters on the Near Futurist, because again, 10 years or so from now, it would be nice to think, first of all, it'd be nice to have a look around and see how much of that near future actually happened that I predicted, and then keep extremely quiet about what the bits that didn't. But it would be nice to feel that could carry on after I've decided it's time to hang up the microphone. as well. Although the idea of hanging up a microphone sounds absolutely poisonous to me at the moment. So whether I will ever really give up or perhaps go part-time or, look at those other options when it comes to that, I don't know.
Well, it is great that you have the flexibility, as we said earlier, of from working from home. So it's not like you need to trek into town and go to a
I don't
studio
have the
anymore.
flexibility. I do not own an office. I have no flexibility whatsoever. This is it. People talk about the flexibility, etc. That's actually a luxury in its own right. I've been a home worker since I went freelance in 1993. It was quite funny actually when the pandemic started. People came to me and said, "How do you cope? How do you do this work from home thing?" And of course, the fact is that your first, the first thing is you do it from choice, and you start when you don't have to, and that meant that the whole mindset was a world away from what people were going through a couple of years ago. So I don't think I was as much help as I would have liked to have been.
And going back to, you just said that you'd like to work with bringing people out of themselves. Is that something that you yourself have had to work on first?
No, I'm a mouthy little sod, always have been. I've always been quite chatty. I've always been quite gregarious. Although I am the person who will go into a network meeting and freeze until someone starts chatting to me, and then it's a bit like having shaken up a Coca-Cola bottle, thinking that looks harmless, and then opening the bottle and then thinking, God, is he going to go away anytime soon? I was that person at school who thought he was terribly amusing, and everybody else was less than convinced. I've come to realize over the years. But this is why I've done things in the past, like I did a stand-up comedy course, not because I wanted to be a stand-up comedian, although when the one gig did go really well, I was tempted, but then realized I didn't want to work Saturday evenings, and there's a bit of a career disadvantage there. I'm not suggesting I got to a stage where I could have, but maybe if I'd worked on it, I could have. I just didn't have that dedication. Yeah, the idea of that was to get me to actually get it under control and to deploy it properly in presentations when I'm on stage emceeing conferences, which I do from time to time, or doing keynote speeches as the Near Futurist, which I've done from time to time. Sort of, right, you don't just joke all the way through, Guy. You think, yeah, that's where there's a lull, or this is the technique you use there, and it ends up as a much more focused and rather better presentation, just because I've sort of had a look at what's going on in my brain under the bonnet.
And under that bonnet, what is the drive, the purpose driven focus?
Over the years, I think it's become about getting people to be able to put their point of view clearly. I say point of view, I tend to deal with commercial organizations. I don't deal with politicians, just because I think many of them are untrainable. B, I don't know how I'd feel if I were training. I mean, let's say you get into a room and there's Donald Trump there and they say, right, you've got to keep him under control. I'd be issuing a refund before I'd even started. That's a very different world. I started off, I think when I was in my early 20s, I wanted to become a newsreader or some sort of presenter like that in the old media, of course, in the 1980s. And over the years, I've realized that so much journalism unintentionally stifles people and their ability to put their point of view, partly because there's so much marketing and actually over media trained comment out there, which really doesn't help. You realize sometimes that somebody is asked a question, say a politician, and say, well, I think the question that needs to be asked is such and such, and you can just see the technique a mile off. But there are people out there genuinely who are not terribly secure about their organization. I still get people coming to me who will say things like, well, I'll be able to check everything the journalist writes, won't I? Or, do I have to pay for journalists to write for me? They're that naive. I've actually occasionally had that when there's internal public or external public relations persons in the room, and I'm thinking, what have you been briefing them? Why are they asking me this? 9 times out of 10, I'm told afterwards they're sanity checking what they've already been told, because I've been in the FT, I've been in the Guardian, I've been in all these various, I've been on the BBC a tiny bit, and they just don't necessarily believe the 25-year-old graduate in his or her second job who's told them this stuff. They think, oh, no, that can't be right. Surely if I pay a journalist enough, I'll get it to the publication. So they asked me instead.
So tell me, Guy, you're talking about not being overly media trained, that journalism can stifle people, and also going back to the elements of not having the barrier to entry to getting in, that it's available to everybody, but the clear purpose for you is to put your point of view clearly across. What are the implications for doing that and also not doing that?
The problem with not putting your point of view across is it can get misunderstood. I appreciate we're going out in September and podcasts hang around for a while. So just if I may put this into context, we're now in August as we speak. The last week we have had the person who may be Prime Minister by the time this comes out, or we may think, we all thought she was going to be Prime Minister, didn't we? One of the two. You can delete that when it comes out, whichever happens to be, Anyway, Liz Truss, for it is she, was in came out with something about settling local governments' pay rates locally. Someone worked out that this was likely to involve cuts in pay for some government officers. And she came out and said, I've been willfully misinterpreted by the press. And then a few days later, she said something else, and one of her supporters came out and said she's been misinterpreted. By the time you get to speak to the press, if you've been properly media trained, you will be making yourself sufficiently clear that you will not be misinterpreted. So it can lead to genuine misinterpretations. There will be people of different political persuasions who will think that's just flip-flopping around and using it as an excuse. You should never use that as an excuse. Actually, I always think when I hear the defense that if somebody has said something that's been, maybe it was quoted out of context or whatever, but the defense, the journalist was incompetent, always sounds like a very feeble defense to me. I would much rather, even if somebody does feel they've been misquoted or something, or that something's been misinterpreted, I'd rather hear them say things like, I couldn't have been making myself clear, or better still, I apologize, let me clarify, or something like that, just sounding less defensive. But there is no substitute for preparation in those instances, and you just hear so much out there which probably is due to misinterpretation, some of which may come out because from the journalist not being the expert in your particular topic. I mean, I've had again, people in the technology security area saying, "Oh, the journalist just wants a simple explanation," and I'm thinking, "Yeah, well, the journalist's only got 300 words, and yes, it is a complex area, but we've actually got to find a medium as sort of a midpoint so that you can explain something simply, and that's where people like me come in."
And having read a fantastic book called Factfulness by Hans Rosling, he talks about how a lot of people's information, their inherent bias is always sort of taking a lean on the way that they're interpreting things. And they're also operating with information that is no longer factful. And he has gone to many sort of national, international meetings and asked senior politicians to the same questions, and a very low percentage actually get them right because they're operating from data that no longer is true. How often is that a part of your work?
Very frequently, and something I would love to see go away is some of the reportage that is based on supposition. There was some very interesting research a while ago which asked people how many people in the UK they believed were from ethnic minorities, and the results were something like 20%, 30%. The actual answer is closer to 3%. There's a clue in the word minorities. And there were all sorts of these things. How quickly do you imagine people can have benefits or housing when they come over here legally? And it was sort of immediately we pay for everything, and it just wasn't true. So I would love to see a bit more fact checking. And I'm afraid we certainly in the UK, probably in the US as well, but I'm not so familiar with their media. We do have a tendency to just believe suppositions. And if I assume something is probably right, it probably is. It may well not be. And the other thing we do is apply US laws to the UK. I've seen so many people saying, when they're writing things, they're saying, how much of a text may I quote without breaching copyright? And people say, oh, there's this law about fair use. Yes, there is in America. In the UK, it's more down to common sense. If you're quoting something, or you're a critic of something, you want to quote a paragraph, no one's going to touch you. But somewhere in the middle, there is a line that is unclear in the UK. So, I would just like to see a little bit more factfulness. In fact, I haven't read this book, but I think it's a very useful point. There's a lovely old video of George W. Bush being asked who's the Prime Minister of Pakistan and things like that, and his answer is General. The General took over. What's his name? General. So yeah, I think people could do with a bit more briefing. And when I'm media training, I always stress that preparation, doing your research with all this spare time you've got. I mean, these people are running companies or whatever, so I don't want to be too unrealistic, but preparation will get them around an awful lot of complications in future.
Let's talk about the sort of sensationalism of the media and how they do have a huge responsibility in the way that the general public are receiving and then interpreting and then using information and data going forward. Share your views on that, Guy.
Well, I think you're right. I think what we've discovered over the last few years is that people will react to their emotions as strongly, if not more strongly, than they will the data. And that's true of both political sides. There's no, it is quite polarized at the moment, and there's no point in taking one side over the other and saying, well, they're all illogical, they're not fact-based. If you look at the amount of retweeting people do of, say, anti-Donald Trump stuff or anti-Boris Johnson or, the Liz Truss questions and things like that. An example cropped up only this week where Boris Johnson was forced to confirm that his holiday, he paid for his holiday himself. It was not paid for by a Tory donor. And there was the amount of retweeting by MPs as well that there was by saying, Boris Johnson must account for this. Boris Johnson hasn't, is this being paid for somebody else? First of all, it speaks about the mistrust that there is around at the moment in politics in general, but also the idea that the fiction, essentially, assuming this his clarification is correct, the fiction that he had got someone else to pay for his holiday really took flight. And it's because people thought, yeah, that's likely. And so they retweeted it. No checking, no waiting for Johnson to comment, just went ahead with it. And when that appears in the media rather than on social media, it does start to gain currency. The thing about the media is that one of the things we are supposed to do, I still consider myself one of them, is that we're supposed to check things from two sources. Now, of course, if the one source is just amplifying another, and you don't know they've picked it up from the same place, that starts to get dangerously diluted.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. And I also, with that mistrust and the failure culture that we're living in, it's almost impossible to make a mistake without you losing your job or having to resign, especially in government.
Well,
Now,
this is it. I think we've got to get to the stage, and we're way apart, we're way away from the media question at the moment. I think you've got to be allowed to make a mistake, and say so. When we mentioned the Liz Truss example earlier about how she said she'd been willfully misrepresented. I would have thought more of her if she'd said, I wasn't being clear, or yes, actually, I've had another look at that. Or even, look, I wasn't expecting the Prime Minister to resign. I've been caught on the hop like everybody else. We are making this up, not making it up as we go along. We are formulating, I'm sure will be a better word, as we go along. There will be discoveries of things that don't actually work. And I think that would be, I would certainly respect any politician who said that more than I respect the sort of, I've got to say that I didn't get it wrong, because that's back to sort of the strong man, I'm invincible school of politics, which I don't think makes sense. Nobody's faultless. There are going to be making mistakes, particularly when things move as quickly as they did a few weeks ago.
and you did say that you don't work with politicians, so I don't want to focus on this area particularly. But what I wanted to, in the media, focus on is, again, that the culture of catching people out seems to be the way that sells papers, sells broadcasts, and across all of the different medium.
I think that's right. It's the old thing about bad news sells. And the way to explain it is if you think about a restaurant, let's say a massive restaurant chain, let's actually use a real example. Let's say McDonald's. I don't know how many people go into a McDonald's restaurant every day and do not get food poisoning. That never hits the headlines because it is expected. You get it right, they whatever your view on the quality of the food is, that's not relevant. You go in there, it does you no harm. That's the whole idea of a restaurant. So inevitably, if a restaurant, not McDonald's, just in case the lawyers are listening, does cause somebody food poisoning, that's the news. So it's the underlying trust, I think, that people have to have, and they expect people to get things right most of the time. So when people say, there's not, there isn't enough focus on good news, well, good news tends to be quite, I hesitate to say normal, given what's happening with heating costs and things like that. But when good news tends to be expected. A country doesn't go to war with another. Big wow, that's countries don't usually, we hope, go to war with each other. Politician doesn't lie is not news in the same way that politician caught lying actually is. Now, when it comes to picking away at every tiny little thing, and I have seen politicians, again, we're talking about politicians again, suggesting that people are picking when actually they've come out with a walloping great big fib or been completely misinformed. That's that's a different thing. But I think it is the journalist's job. It is indeed the podcaster's job to hold people to account. And I can't see a way around that without probing, not necessarily trying to catch people out, but in the same way that you're doing, trying to sort of see what's under the motivation. You're not trying to catch me out. You're trying to find out what makes me tick. And that's a very different thing. And I think I'd like to see more of that and less of the, but didn't you do such and such in 1973? So that's terribly relevant because you were 8 years old and you changed your mind.
So do you think, truth and justice and a fair representation that is your drivers?
Yes, I think certainly truth. Justice is another. I mean, doing somebody's view justice. I mean, not in the judicial sense, but if somebody had committed a crime and they'd served their time and they wanted to be interviewed about that, and there was an audience there, I think they've probably got the right to be heard. People may be inclined to hear them. There is the old debate about what's in the public interest and what the public's interested in, and there may be different things. I think certainly truth is vital. There are always different interpretations of truth. As I was, even in my first year on the trade press, has somebody won a contract? That's the positive news, or has somebody lost a contract? That's the negative news. Both of which will simultaneously be true, and whichever you put in the first sentence is your decision about what's the most important thing and what your reader is going to be most interested in. So there's very, you can have objective truth, but at the next election, general election, somebody will lose, somebody will win, and which of the papers will say somehow somebody managed to lose this in spite of such and such, and the others will be great result for such and such. I think there is still a lot of interpretation, but the central truth has got to still be there.
Is it the fear of failure? Is it the fear factor in essence that drives you said that bad news sells, but is it based on fear?
I don't know. I think there's an element of people, whether it's big business, whether it's politicians, just believing that these people can't be acting in our interests, and that it's therefore healthy to catch them out. I think it's healthy to keep them on their toes and make sure they're aware that they're being watched and held to account, as long as it's justifiably held to account. I'm not sure that fear is part of that from the journalist's point of view. I think maybe perhaps fear, and I would hope that people who are responsible for running our services, for whether that's computing, whether that's utilities, whether that's restaurants or whatever, I would hope it's more than fear driving them. I hope it's genuine wish to do a good job.
Absolutely. And on that note, on that positive note, how would people get in contact with you for you to be able to do a good job with them?
Well, they're welcome to go to my website anytime. Just search for Guy Clapperton. Guy at clapperton.co.uk, two P's in Clapperton, and that's with an ER in the middle, so it's not Clapton. Or just search me on LinkedIn and you'll find me very easily. I'm very lucky my parents didn't call me John Smith. Sorry, apologies to anybody called John Smith out there, but I mean, I'm easy to find, and I'm going to stop talking now.
Guy, all your details will be in the show notes. You'll be able to find them. So thank you so much. And thank you for sharing all about your near future and the underlying trust, the right to be heard, the importance of pushing your point across clearly. It's been a really interesting conversation. How would you like to close out today's episode?
If you're going to go into an interview, preparation is 9/10 of what you need to do. Be clear of your agenda. And if you want to think about what's likely to happen in the near future, have a look at what the company down the road is doing now.
How has this conversation had an impact on you? What value have you received from tuning in? What are your reflections with actions? Please take a moment to leave me an Apple Podcast or Spotify review sharing how Focus on Why has made a difference to you today. Remember, the conversation doesn't end here. To keep it going, simply connect with me on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook or Twitter, or join the Focus on Why Facebook group. All the links are in the show notes. Have a purpose, have a plan, focus on why.